I wanted to discuss this article by Carrie Sandahl about called Queering and Cripping, and it's about queer performance art and people with disabilities performance work. And I thought it was important because Sandahl draws on Judith Butler, and it's one of the most dense theoretical articles. And if you're interested in graduate level study, this is the kind of article that you might come across. So it's called Queering the Crip or Cripping the Queer, Intersections of Queer and Crip Identities in Solo Autobiographical Performance. And it is in the GLQ, a Journal of Lesbian and Gay Studies, and it's from the syllabus. So if you are thinking about graduate level studies, you might want to read this article and think about if you, or if you might want to read this kind of level of theory. So I'll come back to this clip afterwards. I want to discuss these theoretical points. The first is biopolitics and biopower. The second is fetishism and disavowal. The third is about queer crip artists, and it draws on Sandahl's work. Firstly, biopolitics. Throughout the class, we've discussed Michel Foucault's concept of biopolitics. So biopolitics and biopower are closely connected. Biopower is often referred to as the techniques, meaning the different modalities of power that are used to achieve subjugation of people's bodies and control of populations. So biopolitics then is about the overarching technology of power that exists at a different level, on a different scale, and that has a different bearing area and makes use of very different instruments. So if you were to think about technologies of power as opposed to techniques for achieving power relations, then this is the difference. So if, for example, I wanted to use state power to produce future generations of cisgender people, then this would be a large-scale project, and I would need to command state power, meaning I would need to be a political leader. But I would use, say, numerous techniques for achieving the subjugation of people's bodies and the control of population. So India, for example, has a whole series of transgender rights issues, including forms of certification that transgender people need to get in order to self-identify as transgender. So there's a wider biopolitical regime at work, and there are different techniques that are used, like certification processes. And it is debatable what the goals are of the state. And one would argue that maybe the goal is to create future populations of middle-class people who could afford certification. And there are various techniques one could use, like the English language, use of terms, the law, the need for certification. So this is really about having certain control over certain populations. There are a lot of debates that are being had politically, and I'm not a political leader, nor am I trying to run for any political office. So this is just theory, but you could think about this in relation to the class we had about transgender rights and all of the debates being had about children. So new technologies of power exist at different levels on different scales. And the idea of a different bearing area is really about kind of large-scale political projects. Immigration is a good example, that you could have control over migrants, and you could try to control who immigrates from what country and where. But there could also be all of these numerous techniques for achieving control over migrants, then, like the English language, like laws regarding secularism and religious signifiers. I hope this makes sense. This is just my interpretation of Foucault. If you go to graduate level studies and you do a PhD, you can read Foucault and interpret the language of theory as you will. Unlike the law, where there is criminal right and wrong, there are many interpretations of texts. So the fundamental political problem of modernity is not that of a single source of sovereign power, but that of a multitude of forces that act and react amongst each other according to relations of a command and obedience. The relations between man and woman, master and student, doctor and patient, employer and worker that Foucault uses to illustrate the dynamic of the social body are always relations between forces that always involve a power relation. This is also true of the relation between woman and man. That these are power relations where, in really sexist patriarchal thinking, one might think that men always have the right to judge women, and men always have authority over women, and men are in positions of power over women. This is obviously not true, but this is a fantasy that many people like to uphold. It also is about language, that this idea of binary oppositions is what really structures colonial discourse. So ideas of black, white, free, enslaved, woman, man are really about the ways that language really structures the way we think. And this is also about the law, right, wrong, legal, illegal, good, bad. And what post-colonial theorists like Stuart Hall always discussed was language and the ways the English language really allows for one to think in only certain ways and to judge in certain ways. This is also about a certain aesthetics. So far from the Taj Mahal, there is a certain symmetry to Western global North architecture where we think about things matching up in human bodies and lives. And we think about this as being beautiful, but not only beautiful, I think acceptable and normal and desirable, even human. So Mimi Nugan then draws on this idea of biopower from Foucault to talk about the global war on terror. And Nugan argues that beauty has taken on this civilizational dimension during the global war on terror. Mimi Nugan states the other has often been found under the sign of the ugly, which is to say the morally reprehensible, not necessarily to the exclusion of the aesthetically pleasurable as the limit of the human and as the enemy of beauty. Ugliness, furthermore, has a civilizational dimension. So I really like theory, and I also am going to speak with some other people in a country called India soon enough. So this recording is interesting to think about in relation to India and aesthetics and ideas of the perfectible body. So Mimi Nugan writes, the forces of globalization brought together disparate but not disconnected discourses of neoliberal governance through which a biopower of beauty and a geopolitics of humanitarianism might encounter each other. So the idea of benevolent salvation of the other has also been present in the global war on terror, and it's especially present in racist global North media, where there's the idea of salvation rather than economic benefits that come with immigration. Beauty is positioned as the means and the ends of a civilizing process that necessitates waging war, writes Nugent. And Nugent is interested in the ways that the veil comes to signify in global North imaginaries that often propagate very sexist reductions of human subjectivity to gendered ideals of beauty, whiteness, and middle class aesthetics. Beauty as a discourse and concern about the vitality of the body, but also of the soul, can and does become an important site of signification, power, and knowledge about how to live. So I will send you this PowerPoint. And as I've already discussed, I think in previous lectures, there are a whole series of laws in Quebec that are being put into place to try to ban visible religious signifiers from the public sphere, including the veil, the niqab, and other religious signifiers that Nugent writes have been pathologized by white, Western, secular, global North people. If beauty, writes Nugent, is a category through which particularly, especially feminine bodies achieve humanness, and if humanness is a quality distributed unevenly through forms of civilizational thinking, then a concept of beauty informs in some important way how human rights are understood. I think also that there is this obvious idea of authority that I also always think of when I teach in the global North. Because I am a woman and a person of color, people are always kind of telling me what to do as if they're in a position of authority over me. There's also this idea of granting someone rights as if they even want them. Bollywood, this is not the Taj Mahal. Yeah. So I'm going to finish up with this lecture at the U of Guelph Humber, and then I'll be off. And I can use these clips in other ways. So the body is also a commodity, and Baudrillard discusses this notion of the word fetish. And what Baudrillard argues is that this word is about an etymology from the artificial and the cosmetic, which implies a homology between the fetishized figure of bodily beauty and the fetishism of the commodity. So this equation of beauty and truth and innocence and freedom and rights is also about capitalism. And if you spend a lot of money, then I suppose you have a certain body that looks as though it can make a lot of money. Whether or not that is true perhaps depends upon the economy, higher education, and whether one is actually in a position of authority or not. The commodity, too, is haunted by the gap between knowledge and belief. By exploiting the gap between knowledge and belief inherent in the complexity of value, the commodity can erase its origin in the labor of the working class at the production line and turn a phantasmatic cosmetic face to the world. Western man gradually learns what it means to be a living species in a living world, to have a body, conditions of existence, probabilities of life, an individual and collective welfare that could be modified. So when Western man is a person of color, what I've also found is that there are many people of color who have an obsessive desire to have control over women's bodies, sometimes women they don't even know. And I think this is also about wanting to have control over something that is not economic in nature, because those dreams might not come true. This idea of having control over the body and the body beautiful is something that comes with privilege. So this article is about teeth in Mumbai and the teeth of the children of Dharavi. The streets smell of sewage and sweets. There are not enough toilets. There is not enough water. There is not enough space. Laborers sleep in sheds known as pongal houses, 6 men, maybe 8, packed into a single tiny room, multiplied by many tiny rooms. Hygiene is terrible. Diarrhea and malaria are common. Tuberculosis floats in the air, spreads by coughing or spitting. Dharavi, like the epic slums of Karachi, Pakistan, or Rio de Janeiro, is often categorized as a problem still unsolved, an emblem of inequity pressing against Mumbai, India's richest and most glamorous city. At the slum's periphery, Sion Hospital treats 3,000 patients every day, many from Dharavi, often children who are malnourished or have asthma or diarrhea. Premature tooth decay is so widespread in children that doctors call them dental cripples. So, this idea of turning teeth into a commodity, turning the body into commodity, and then turning commodities into things that are beautiful to be looked at, to be valued, to be prized, so that you can have an entire society where commodities talk to commodities is the essence of capitalism, and it only could be dreamed of for the privileged few. There are many people who might think about using their degrees to make money who wouldn't understand this obsession with the body beautiful as a form of capital. So for Foucault, resistance is never conceptualized only in terms of negation. Nevertheless, as you see it, resistance is not solely a negation, but a creative process. To create and recreate, to transform the situation, to participate actively in the process, that is to resist. So resistance comes first, and resistance remains superior to other forces of the process. Power relations are obliged to change with the resistance. So I think the resistance is the main word, the key word in this dynamic. Finally, I'll finish by discussing the resistance of queer crip artists. Carrie Sandahl's work discusses the ways that disability studies' stance against regimes of the normal may appear to be more of the same. As Judith Butler argues in Bodies That Matter, the term queer, rather than describing a specific identity, can be considered a site of collective contestation, the point of departure for a set of historical reflections and future imaginings. Thus, it must remain that which is, in the present, never fully owned, but always only redeployed, twisted, queered from a prior usage, and in the direction of urgent and expanding political purposes. Because disability civil rights could be considered just such an urgent political purpose, one must assume that queer could be redeployed in its service. More, the term cripple, like queer, is fluid and ever changing, claimed by those whom it did not originally define. I hope this records. I'm having so many internet difficulties. Um, so the term cripple like queer is fluid and ever changing, claimed by those whom it did not originally define. As a pejorative, the term queer was originally targeted as gays and lesbians, yet targeted at gays and lesbians, yet its rearticulation as a term of pride is currently claimed by those who may not consider themselves homosexuals, such as transgender transsexuals, heterosexuals, sex radicals, and others. Theory has to understand that different identity environments are neither parallel, so that the tactics and values of one might be assumed to be appropriate for another, not separable. Queer struggles and those of other identity movements, or alternatively of other new social movements, often differ in important ways, even when they are intermingled in experience. So, these ideas of theory being intermingled in experience, I think, are important. And I'm not thinking that one set of identity politics is reducible to the other. Also, what Sandahl describes is how queer theory and Disability studies always discuss the most urgent political questions of our time. And some of the most urgent political questions around laws and the legal rights of children to self identify, to take hormones, are about the medical system and the human body. So, if you're interested in graduate school level studies or law school, then you might be interested in thinking about queer theory and this idea of the body and who has legal rights over the body and at what age. As outsiders, queers and crips refuse to minimize their difference by passing as either straight or able bodied. Instead, they appropriate and rearticulate labels the mainstream once used to silence or humiliate them, and that the liberal factions of their subcultures would like to suppress. Butler, discussing how those who are abjected come to make their claim through and against the discourses that have sought their repudiation. And Butler argues that the very power of the term queer to injure has enabled its reworking as a term of empowerment. The same is true of the term cripple. As the poet and essayist Eli Clare puts it in Exile and Pride, queer and cripple are cousins. Words to shock, words to infuse with pride and self-love, words to resist internalized hatred, words to help forge a politics. So I'll play this whole video about queer disability arts. I will not interrupt it.
We're a community that's so used to being outside and misfits and not able to enter the room in a lot of places. And so we should not allow that to happen within our community as well if we want to feel proud of our own community. I'm Mari. I'm a writer, podcaster, and storyteller. I'm bi, I'm gender fluid, and I'm Indo-Caribbean. Add the disability onto that, and it's a lot of very different experiences that you don't see represented anywhere. I feel like people often think people like me don't exist. And a lot of the time I feel like my experiences aren't valued or understood because they're so particular. That's why I think it's important to talk about these experiences. I wanted to hear from artists about the different experiences they deal with and the barriers they face and how that influences their work. I wanted to speak to artists who didn't care about overcoming their disabilities and instead embraced them and let their experiences fully inform their art. Wajong Koo is a visual artist who works mostly with mosaics and is a drummer with the Raw Taiko drumming group. I wanted to talk with Koo about their work and the accessibility of visual arts. Koo, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm a multidisciplinary artist. I'm sort of focusing in now on mostly mosaic as a visual artist. I think a lot about the fact that I chose a very labor-intensive medium. And as a physically chronically ill person, I don't know why I did that, but I'm still happy with the decision. As a disabled person doing mosaic work, it's a constant negotiation with my body.
What do you do to help take care of yourself when you're doing this kind of work?
My major access need in terms of studio space is a place to rest. Because I find when I'm doing mosaic work, 2 hours, 2 consecutive hours is about my maximum before I need to lay down for maybe 2 more hours and then I can go back. I think a lot about how to make a living as an artist. To make art, you need money. And to have money, you need to have a job. And if you have a job, which I can't work a full-time job, but if I'm working some type of job, I don't have the spoons to actually also focus on my arts practice. So for me, I feel like the only way that I can fully commit to my arts practice is if I have the resources to do that. And I think a lot of people struggle with that. I think a lot about care, and I think all of the disabled people in my life also think a lot about care, and that reflects in their work. Um, and care in like a very nuanced way.
There is so much like compassion that can be found in disabled arts that I think would be missed out otherwise if we didn't have disabled artists.
Definitely. I can't speak to all experiences of disability, but in terms of my art, I think big themes in my work is like pain, grief, and then also the like healing and joy, and connection. If like disabled people were not making art, I think there would just be so much that we're not getting.
Rosina Kazi is a musician and artist who runs Unit 2, a space dedicated to hosting performances by 2S LGBTQ artists. I wanted to ask them about the barriers in the music industry and what they're doing to build their own more inclusive community spaces instead. Do you want to start off telling us a bit about LOL and your music?
So I'm in an electronic, radical, racialized duo called Lal. We've been around for quite a long time. It's myself and Nicholas Murray. Black, brown duo. I'm queer identified. And we also run this space called Unit 2. And it's a space dedicated to sort of QT, BIPOC, Two-Spirit, and friends. And we really try to have accessible space in terms of economic accessibility, but also physical accessibility. We wanted to create something that was alternative to what was happening in like the club scene, for example. And we found that it was just becoming more expensive. A lot of violence, whether it be sexual harassment or whether it be violence against racialized folks. And we just really wanted to create a space where people felt safer. I think we can shift things for people to feel safer. And that was the whole intention of Unit 2. I've definitely seen the language change. And I've seen people or organizations or institutions at least make an attempt to talk about crip or disability or racialized folks or, deaf and hard of hearing. So there's definitely, or indigenous issues as well. So there's definitely an awareness. I think what bothers me is that when you look closely at the power structure of who runs things, that hasn't changed. Mm-hmm. It's still mostly white cis men. Maybe now there's more white cis women or queer and trans folks, but there's still an issue for me when it comes to power. Taking a second to really look at the organizations that you're working for or the crews that you're in and notice what's missing. It's the first thing I ask when I go to some meetings or whatnot, who's missing? And if we just stopped and said who's missing, that could actually shift a bunch of stuff. If this city, Toronto, is 55% racialized, and possibly folks who have disabilities, then that needs to change. Because everyone's going to get older and you're going to have a disability at some point. So we need to start looking at that now,
When we talk about art and media, it's important to look at not just who's in the room, but also who's not. We can learn so much about compassion and care from disabled artists, and we lose important perspectives without their voices in the conversation. I'm Mari. Thanks so much for listening.
Okay, so that is a clip about disability arts, and there's a festival called Tangled, which happens. This is an old clip, but I think Tangled still happens. If you're interested also in getting involved in artistic projects and activism here in Toronto. Tangled art and disability is something you could Google. I hope that everything is still in existence in the future after the global pandemic. I'm sorry about the recordings. Sometimes things just don't record, so I'm really hoping this time this records. I've tried multiple times. If not, I'm going to play you a full film called Margarita with the Straw, which is a good film, but I think it's important to go over these theoretical concepts. So I'm going to finish by discussing Judith Butler in detail, because I'm hoping that it will be useful for anyone who's writing a proposal for graduate school in this time, and also for law school.
A very important thing to have as a young person trying to get into your field is clarity in what you want. Hey, what's up? My name is Carrie Eastcott, and I'm the Outreach and Community Engagement Coordinator at Tangled Art and Disability. Tangled Art and Disability is an annual festival, multidisciplinary arts festival that showcases professional artists with disabilities. Volunteering. I started out as a volunteer about 3 years ago at Tangled, which was called Abilities Arts Festival. And from there, I wouldn't leave the organization. I think it's a multi-tiered approach. I think for my mental health, planning really helps me, and goal setting. It just helps me, again, have a clear mind and see what's coming in the near future so that I'm not stressed out. For physical health, I try to eat really well, and I walk as much as I can instead of maybe taking the TTC. If I have time, walk somewhere. Basketball, yoga. And another really important thing is community healing and like collective healing from friends, or, I think it's important to surround yourself with people who sort of think similarly to you, and kind of cushion yourself around folks who believe in you and believe in similar things that you do. A lot of my education has been done outside of the classroom, and it's been through people and my relationships with people. And I can really give a lot of credit to people of the city, storytellers of the city, whether it's like hip hop artists or theater performers, sharing their stories or issues going on in the city and the world. I really learn best by seeing and learning through stories. It really seems to like get through to me. Out of Your Mind is a 10-week workshop program that we're working on right now. And thanks to the sponsorship of In Spirit Foundation and Outreach Toronto. And basically, this will take young, aspiring artists with disabilities through different storytelling forms, spoken word and monologue creation, hip hop, MCing, freestyling. And the main goal is to provide space for people to find their voice and start shaping their artistic form. So we're super excited about that.
So that is about Tangled Art and Disability. Um, so what Sandahl discusses are these terms queering and cripping, and they draw on Judith Butler extensively throughout uh, their work, and they discuss how queering and cripping are both theatrical and everyday practices deployed to challenge oppressive norms, build community, and maintain the practitioner's self-worth. Butler explains that queering is a refusal of the law in the form of the parodic inhabiting of conformity that subtly calls into question the legitimacy of the command, a repetition of the law into hyperbole, a rearticulation of the law against the authority of the one who delivers it. So these ideas of theatrical hyperbole are found in the artists that Sandahl discusses. And by exaggerating a set of norms, what theater often does and what art often does is to call into question those norms. So Judith Butler's work, Bodies That Matter, is foundational in gender studies. And most, I think, gender studies programs would still look to Butler to denaturalize this idea of gender identity. Butler writes, what constitutes the fixity of the body, its contours, its movements, will be fully material, but materiality will be rethought as the effect of power, as power's most productive effect, and there will be no way to understand gender as a cultural construct, which is opposed upon the surface of matter, understood either as the body in quotes or its given sex. Rather, once sex itself is understood in its normativity, the materialization of the body will not be thinkable apart from the materialization of that regulatory norm. Sex is thus not simply what one has, or a static description of what one is. It will be one of the norms by which the one becomes viable at all, that which quantifies a body for life within the domain of cultural intelligibility. So the example that Judith Butler gives is when the doctor says it's a girl, it's a boy when a child is born. And what Butler argues is that this linguistic injunction is not descriptive, it is performative. So by ascribing meaning to gender, you make gender by ascribing meaning to male, female as being a central identity marker that naturalizes sex onto the body, then you normalize a set of binary power relations between male and female. And in reality, someone might not say this in other contexts. If you were born in other places and other times, people might just wonder if it is a healthy child because there are so many stillborn children born. But this idea of gender becomes central to identity and to cultural intelligibility. At stake, writes Butler, in such a reformulation of the materiality of bodies will be the following: the recasting of the matter of bodies as the effect of a dynamic of power, such that the matter of bodies will be indissociable from the regulatory norms that govern their materialization and the signification of those material effects. So even the constant use of terms like beautiful over and over again is obviously something that happens in a rich country, as opposed to people asking if you had your lunch. Number two, the understanding of performativity, not as the act by which a subject brings into being what he names, but rather as the reiterative power of discourse to produce the phenomena that regulates and constrains. So the kind of repetition of terms over and over again, like male or female, like good or bad, like nice or mean, all the kind of discussion about skin color that is particularly common among middle class people of color, is about regulating and constraining certain bodies and certain minds. The uh, construal of sex no longer as a bodily given on which the construct of gender is artificially imposed, but as a cultural norm which governs the materialization of bodies. And number 4, Butler in Bodies That Matter discusses a rethinking of the process by which a bodily norm is assumed, appropriated, taken on as not, strictly speaking, undergone by a subject, but rather that the subject, the speaking I, is formed by virtue of having gone through such a process of assuming a sex. A linking of this process of assuming a sex with the question of identification and with the discursive means by which the heterosexual imperative enables certain sexed identifications and forecloses and or disavows other identifications. This exclusionary matrix by which subjects are formed thus requires the simultaneous production of a domain of abject beings, those who are not yet subjects, but those who form the constitutive outside to the domain of the subject. The abject designates here precisely those unlivable and uninhabitable zones of social life, which are nevertheless densely populated by those who do not enjoy the status of the subject, by those living under the sign of the unlivable, is required to circumscribe the domain of the subject. So in order to know yourself as a livable subject, you have to then construct an abject. And I think what's interesting is to think about the English language. So terms like queer or transgendered are not terms like hijra used in India or Gwajisara used in Pakistan. And the English language, I think, is something that exists outside of this theoretical term and outside of Western feminist discourse, which is often so fixated on language. So this film explores the intersection of queerness and disability, looking at the ways that culture and language are also part and parcel of many other communities, including the autistic and the deaf community.
Okay, so www.loveintersections.com.
There's so many parallels between deaf identity, deaf culture, and autistic identity and autistic culture. I would view autism to be something you can take pride in, something that I can be proud and say, well, I'm autistic, that's part of my identity. It influences who I am and how I see the world. To pass as neurotypical in a neurotypical world gives you advantages. And this is where I see a lot of like queer parallels. If you don't act strange or act differently from others, then you're more likely to pass that job interview or be able to be in a classroom and have everyone include you. I like soft textures a lot. It's very comforting for me. Stimming is how we express ourselves. It's a part of our natural body language. I can tell a lot about what other autistic people are thinking and feeling from how they stim and move their bodies. And autistic body language is easier for me to interpret than neurotypical body language. Why is knitting a good stim? It's a socially acceptable way not to look to in people's eyes. That's really great. It gives your hands something to do. You end up with a very nice finished product. It's also very soft. Everyone stims. Everyone stims and everyone stims differently. We all do it. It's just that for some people we do it in really cool ways. Queer culture is different from straight culture, and autistic culture is different from non-autistic or holistic culture. I think it's very interesting to see how queer space is such a different feel and how autistic space is such a different feel. And where those intersect might be a really great space. Of course, there's a lot of complicated feelings about disability. It's not all positive. There's a lot of ableism in the world. There's a lot of things that make it hard for me to function in this world purely due to the physical aspects of my disabilities. But in the end, I think that's all part of the human experience. Part about human diversity is to embrace it, not shy away from it, and not try to fix or cure it. Fix the world, don't fix us. There's a lot of hope I have for the world to move towards that place.
So that's a short film, and there are other clips. Go back to this. But the main point of Sandahl's article and looking at these theories is that these ideas of queering and cripping are really about refusing to be harmed by others, I think, and harmed by the words of others, in the sense that ideas of curing or changing people and forcing people's bodies to conform were ideas that could be found in Nazi discourse. And what Judith Butler discusses is how this idea of abjection, constructing people who are out of the bounds of humanity or who must correct themselves in order to belong to society, is a very violent idea. So Sandahl states that in queer communities, the application of this critique has been given its own verb, to queer. Queering describes the practices of putting a spin on mainstream representations to reveal latent queer subjects, of appropriating a representation for one's own purposes, forcing it to signify differently, or of deconstructing a representation's heterosexism. Similarly, some disabled people practice cripping. Cripping spins mainstream representations or practices to reveal able-bodied assumptions and exclusionary effects. Both queering and cripping exposes the arbitrary delineation between normal and defective, and the negative social ramifications of attempts to homogenize humanity, and both disarm what is painful with wicked humor, including camp. So Butler argues that there is this exclusionary matrix by which subjects are formed, which requires the simultaneous production of the domain of the abject. And Judith Butler states the abject designates here precisely those unlivable and uninhabitable zones of social life, which are nevertheless densely populated by those who do not enjoy the status of the subject, and whose living under the sign of the unlivable is required to circumscribe the domain of the subject. This zone of inhabitability will constitute the defining limit of the subject's domain. It will constitute the site of dreaded identification, against which and by virtue of which the domain of the subject will circumscribe its own claim to autonomy in life. In this sense, then, the subject is constituted with a force of exclusion and abjection, one which produces a constitutive outside to the subject, an abjected outside, which is, after all, inside the subject as its own founding repudiation. So one thing that I hope that the course has allowed you to think about is about how these ideas of norms and how we live, which Mimi Nugan discusses in relation to the global war on terror and this projection of the abject Muslim body from the global south who will not conform to secular norms, is also about the global south itself. My research is on India, and I really like going to India. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of teeth that look a lot of different ways, that can chew food that is not necessarily the norm here, and yet still perhaps desirable to some. So I'll finish with this clip about migration called Margarita with a Straw. This is a good film about India and the Indian feminist movement, which exists transnationally. for Sandahl and for a lot of queer theorists and scholars of disability studies is that there is always a threat and a disruption to this idea of abjection and to the production of the abject body. So, what Butler states is that the task will be to consider this threat and disruption not as a permanent contestation of social norms condemned to the pathos of perpetual failure, but rather as a critical resource in the struggle to rearticulate the very terms of symbolic legitimacy and intelligibility. So, the very ways that we think of things like failure and success, I think, can be really rooted in normative thinking that causes one to really try to mimic the most privileged people rather than thinking about the importance of living one's own life and following one's own heart and desire. So I hope that the course has allowed you to think about certain things. I can't remember if I've mentioned this, but I think one of the things you can think about in your future graduate studies, and many of you wrote about beauty throughout the class and about racist ideals of beauty, which can be hurtful and which can prevent people from having work opportunities or getting married and having children.